Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on planning scope, Part 2. Now let's talk about some of the tools and techniques of the collect requirements process. Expert judgment is at the top of the list, of course. You will see expert judgment all over the place in your planning processes. Collecting requirements is business analysis, and so having some expertise in business analysis would be very important to your project. It would be useful to have someone assigned to your project who is a business analyst. You're also going to be generating an awful lot of requirements documentation. Having a documentation specialist would be very helpful. You'll probably also be generating a certain number of diagrams to visually represent a lot of these requirements and how they interrelate. Having someone in the organization that can help you with diagramming or at least provide some advice and guidance on the best tools you could use and which tools are best for different kinds of representations would be a benefit to your project. You're going to have a lot of meetings with a lot of people, a lot of different key stakeholders that have very different ideas and expectations. And so you will need some good facilitation skills and conflict management skills. And you may want to consult with others to help you with those skills and either have someone on your team that can assist with this or that can help coach you and help you to resolve some tricky problems and situations as you're collecting requirements. Of course, the collect requirements process involves a lot of data gathering, and there are many different data gathering tools and techniques that you can use. We've already discussed brainstorming, which can include your simple brainstorming, but also your brain writing, which involves writing it down first before you start your discussion, or the nominal group technique, or even the Delphi technique that has these multiple iterations of experts privately providing their recommendations and then sharing those also anonymously until you come up with one or more excellent options. Other ways to collect requirements include one-on-one interviews, focus groups where you get small groups of people together that are key stakeholders or subject matter experts. Also, surveys and questionnaires to gather information and perhaps to aggregate them and come up with some statistical analysis of the results. You may also want to use benchmarking to collect requirements. Benchmarking is simply comparing yourself or your planned products or current products to those of your competitors or those in other departments, but basically it's doing a comparison between what you've planned and what else is available in the market. This will give you ideas on requirements that would be useful to add to your product. You can also use benchmarking to identify different processes and practices that you could follow, not only in the development of your product or service, but also in the project management of it. The PMBOK guide also mentions the data analysis tool of document analysis, which is simply looking at and analyzing the contents of various documents that can be useful for you in collecting requirements. And these would include that list of documents that we reviewed as inputs to the collect requirements process, such as the project charter or a request for proposal and so on. Another category of tools and techniques is decision making. Your stakeholders aren't all going to agree. When they don't agree, how do you decide which requirements to include and what the details should be of those requirements? It could be simply up to the project sponsor to make that decision, which would be an autocratic type of decision making. Or you may have a decision making board or committee that makes these decisions. If that's the case, then you need to come up with some voting rules for how this committee or board is going to vote and decide on the requirements. Will the rule be that they have to be unanimous? Or will it be by majority vote? Or a plurality? There are many different types of voting techniques. These are a couple of the most common. Majority, of course, simply means that most of the people vote for a certain thing. Plurality, meaning that whichever option gets the most votes, even if it's not at least half, is the option that you go with. Another technique is to use what is known as multi-criteria decision analysis. This is when you decide that there are many factors involved in deciding what's important, whether it's when you're evaluating which requirements are important or whether you're evaluating potential vendors. This type of approach can help you work through all those different factors. You can come up with using voting, as you would in other circumstances, but then once you've agreed on the criteria, you can use those criteria to make decisions on individual requirements. These criteria can be put into a matrix or spreadsheet that can evaluate your measurements of all these different criteria and will help to generate your answers for you. I've used this technique many times and found it to be very effective, particularly in situations where the decision is very complex and the stakeholders have very different ideas about what's important for the project. Factors that you can use for your criteria could include any number of things, such as cost, benefit. You could even run NPV analysis on some of these requirements. Risk could be one. You may want to significantly weight the amount of risk that's involved in individual requirements. This can include the range of possible value. If you come up with an NPV, that's a single number, but there'll be a range. And some requirements may have a small range of possible value, while others could have a wide range of possible value and even have the possibility of having negative value. So this kind of risk can be factored in to your multi-criteria decision analysis. Another factor that you could include is alignment. How well does this requirement align with your organizational strategy or your organizational culture? Does it align well with your project objectives? Is this a requirement that's long-term or short-term? Fairness or balance could be another factor. You may decide that it's best to make sure that your requirements don't come from one or just a few key stakeholders and that other stakeholders get nothing. You may decide that you want to spread that out a little bit and make sure that all of your key stakeholders are getting something out of this project. Whatever the criteria are, it's very helpful to figure them out in advance, because once you have agreement on that, you'll find that there's little or no argument once you run all the requirements through these criteria and then use the results to prioritize your requirements. The PMBOK guide also identifies 2 different types of data representation tools and techniques for the collect requirements process. These are affinity diagrams and mind maps. These aren't the only ones you could use, but there are a couple that are very common and useful. The term affinity diagram may sound complex and obscure, but it's really very simple. It's the process of organizing many ideas or issues into groups for review or analysis. Here's a very simple example of what an affinity diagram is. Here on the left, you have a whole bunch of ideas that you've come up with, perhaps from brainstorming or some other technique. All of these ideas are then organized into different groups or categories that make sense. And as you organize these into categories, now you have an affinity diagram. It really is just that simple. Creating a mind map is often just as simple as going to the whiteboard and drawing it out by hand, and then taking a picture of it. Or there are software tools that you can use to then take what you have done on the whiteboard and make it look a little bit nicer like this. Or you could start off with the software tool itself, as long as that technology doesn't get in your way and slow down this creative process. Another interesting technique that you can use in collecting requirements is the nominal group technique, which falls under the category of interpersonal and team skills. This nominal group technique is a form of structured brainstorming. It's like brainstorming in that you get a group of people together, generally face to face, but it's got 4 specific steps to it. The first is that you'll pose the idea or the question or problem, and each of the participants will privately record their ideas. Then in the next step, the moderator or facilitator shares all of these ideas with the group. Each idea is then discussed and clarified, which may include grouping these, such as in an affinity diagram or mind map. And then, once this has all been discussed, there's some private voting that happens. Each participant will vote privately on these different ideas. You can use just about any voting method you choose, whether single step or multi-step, but the idea is that you vote on these requirements and use the results to narrow down and focus in on those requirements that you're going to select for the project. This more structured form of brainstorming can be valuable to get more equal participation than unstructured brainstorming, because you may have members of the team that might not otherwise contribute as much because of some people in the room who have such strong personalities or feelings or opinions that they can overwhelm the group. So if you're concerned about making sure that everyone gets more participation and more of a voice, then you may want to consider the nominal group technique over simple brainstorming. Another technique is known as observation, sometimes called job shadowing, in which you watch as someone does their job. This is particularly valuable for jobs that are complex or difficult to describe. You can watch them as they work and record information, write it all down, ask questions. This way, you can learn what their job is all about and get some insights into what the requirements are. You can also do this the other way around. For example, if there's a process that someone does sitting at the computer, either they can do it as the experts, or you can sit down at the computer and they can talk you through it. Sometimes, although this takes a little bit more time, sometimes it's easier to understand all of the details and to really internalize them if you've had to go through the process yourself. Either way, this sort of job shadowing process can help you to discover all sorts of hidden requirements that might not have surfaced otherwise if you hadn't actually experienced it or watched it happen. Many years ago, I worked for a company that did some pioneering work in user interface design, and the way they did this was as they developed new proposed software, they would have people sit down in a lab in which they were asked to perform a certain task on the computer. And while they were working, they were being observed and video recorded and voice recorded. And they were also asked to think out loud, to verbalize their thoughts as they were going through the process. And to, say out loud, oh, how do I do this? Or where do I find that? Oh, it's up here. That sort of thing. And by doing this, they were able to test out new user interfaces to see which ones were the most intuitive and which ones allowed users to complete the task most naturally and quickly. Facilitation is also a valuable skill in collecting requirements. You may want to hold some workshops, which are focused sessions of key stakeholders, in order to quickly gather requirements. This type of face-to-face interaction and requirements collecting allows you to quickly define different cross-functional requirements and to quickly reconcile stakeholder differences, because you have these stakeholders all in the room together, all at once. As differences arise, you can address them immediately, rather than finding these differences much later and maybe never finding them at all until it's too late. These types of facilitated workshops also help you to build trust and relationships between these key stakeholders, because it allows them to get to know each other better and to understand each other, which will help to improve the communication between them, as well as get you better consensus on the requirements. Here are a few more examples of facilitated workshops that you can use to collect requirements. The Joint Application Design and Development Sessions, or JAD for short, originally come from the software development industry. And these sessions bring together business subject matter experts along with the development team to discuss the needs of the stakeholders and to come up with what the requirements should be and to help improve this software development process. Quality Function Deployment, or QFD, comes from the manufacturing industry. And this is another technique that is a facilitated workshop in which the focus is to determine the critical characteristics for new product development. And it starts by gathering the customer needs, known as the voice of the customer. Once these needs are understood, they can be sorted and prioritized, and then goals can be set based on these needs. Another type of facilitated workshop could be to create user stories. User stories are requirements that have a little bit more information to them. Instead of just specifying what is needed, you also specify who needs it and why they need it. Sometimes this is referred to as the role, the goal, and the motivation. Let's illustrate the difference with an example. Suppose you have a software system, say case management files. So there's a lot of information in there. And let's suppose there's a requirement that comes up that each note or change needs to have a timestamp. Okay, you could record this as the requirement to have a timestamp. But knowing who needs it and why can add so much more. If you ask why, and you find out that the way that this timestamp is going to be used is to display all of the notes and changes in chronological order in a report that you give to the department head, and that's the only reason it's used, now you know the who and the why. This is for the department head, and it's so that they can see all of this in chronological order. Now, if that's it, that's a very different requirement than this next one. Let's suppose instead you still want a timestamp, but who wants it and why? Suppose the reason you want it is so that you can take this information into a court of law and use it to guarantee and prove that these changes or notes were made on these days at these times. And what if the requirement is also to guarantee that the content of these notes and changes has not been altered since it was timestamped? That's a very different requirement that may sound the same on the surface until you start talking about who needs it and why they need it. How are they going to use this feature? The requirements are much more stringent if you need to take this into court, and will involve some cryptography in order to make this work. Another tool that you can use in collecting requirements is the context diagram. This is a simple diagram in which you put your system in the middle, and then around it, you draw boxes or circles or whatever. You draw in all of the different people or systems that interact with your system in the middle. These other people or systems are referred to as actors that act upon or with your core system in the middle. There's not a lot of detail in a context diagram, but it's useful for quickly showing all of the different people and systems at a high level that interact with your system, and helps you to identify any gaps that you may have in your requirements. As you collect requirements, you may also want to consider the use of prototypes. These are very helpful for getting early feedback on your requirements and your proposed solutions. Different types of prototyping include storyboarding, mock-ups, and simulations. Storyboarding comes from the film industry, in which very early on, the ideas for a film are put together in very rough sketches showing the different scenes and actions as different little boxes or different sheets of paper, and you can then refine these and put them in different order and get consensus on these different concepts before you've put in a lot of effort to polish them. This concept of storyboarding can be applied to virtually any project, and you see it quite often in the software development industry, in which the different steps and screens and things that are involved in a new piece of software can be sketched out ahead of time before the software is actually written. Blueprints, such as the blueprint for a home, are an excellent example of the kind of prototyping or mock-up that you can put together in order to get early feedback on requirements before you go to all the effort of a large project in which once you start building, it can be much, much more costly to make changes. In the construction industry, blueprints are a well-established way of gathering and getting feedback on requirements early on before expending a lot of money. More recently, using more advanced software, you can now create more of a 3D simulation of what a proposed house plan would look like, such as this one. Can you see how much more feedback you could get and much better feedback you can get by having something that is as complete and easy to visualize as this? Notice how much easier it is to look at the living room here and say, based on the furniture you've put in here and all that, I think that this living room is just a little bit small for me, and I'd like to make it larger. And so let's push that exterior wall out 3 feet. I'd rather have those 3 feet in the living room than on the patio. In software development, it's quite common to use something called wireframes, which are rough sketches of the screens that you're planning on building. They're kind of like storyboards or blueprints, but they're very rough, as you haven't gone to all the trouble of figuring out all the colors, and everything isn't exactly placed exactly where all the pixels go, but it allows you to very quickly figure out what needs to be on the screens, where things need to be relative to each other, and it's easy to make changes at this stage. Then, once you have your wireframes agreed upon, then you can move on to visual designs and take those wireframes, give them to a visual designer, and have him actually create some proposed screens and give a proposed look and feel to them. And you could even come up with multiple versions of these. One that's a little bit more modern, one that's a little more retro, one that's more of a metro look. Anything you like, different color schemes, different fonts. And then by doing this using just the visual designs, these are just the pictures without any functionality yet. You can't click on anything. They're just accurate pictures of what you would like to build. The collect requirements process is a very in-depth process that takes some time and has a lot to it. So we've covered a lot in this lesson, but think back and see how much you can remember so far. Remember what are the main outputs of collect requirements. There are only 2. They are the requirements documentation and the requirements traceability matrix. There are a lot of inputs, but you can probably figure out most of them just by thinking about where you might get requirements information from and where you might get valuable information about how to collect requirements and who to collect them from. So your inputs include things like your project charter, different components of your project management plan, particularly the scope and requirements management plans, and the stakeholder engagement plan. There are numerous project documents and business documents, agreements, and other enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets that you can draw upon as inputs. And we've covered several different tools and techniques, from expert judgment to various different data gathering techniques like brainstorming, interviews, focus groups, surveys and questionnaires, and benchmarking, document analysis, decision making, including not only voting, but the multi-criteria decision analysis technique, data representations, including affinity diagrams and mind mapping, and interpersonal and team skills that you would use in nominal group technique, or that you would use in observation or job shadowing, and several different types of facilitated workshops. The context diagram is also useful, as well as numerous different types of prototyping. And that's it for part 2. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.